The first thing Kara Vance noticed about the barracks was the smell, a layered cocktail of heated composite armor, recycled air, and oil that clung to the throat like a reprimand. The second thing she noticed was the silence, the way conversation thinned when she stepped through the threshold with a duffel in one hand and her so-called fabric suit folded neatly over her arm. Every wall carried banners in languages she could not read without the Academy overlay, but even without translation, she sensed the weight of history. She walked past a rack of brass breastplates, slabbed, ridged, studded with ceremonial scars, past a row of polished Kinetic exoshells that glittered like beetle wings, past a bank of helmets carved with oaths that meant nothing to her yet and might never mean anything if she washed out before week's end. She set her duffel on the lower bunk that had been tagged with her name in neutral gray and waited for the questions. They came on cue, carried by a voice that sounded like smooth gravel poured into a drum. "Is that your armor, human?" asked a Brath cadet with ridges along his brow that shone like burnished stone. He did not stand to address her. He lounged with the lazy confidence of a predator that expected slow prey. His name patch read Surak in blocky letters. She met his gaze with the quiet that always served her better than any clever retort. She held the suit up by the shoulders. To an untrained eye, it looked like a jumpsuit sewn from matte charcoal cloth, soft enough to fold into a square, featureless except for the seam that ran from sternum to navel and the faint patterning along the ribs that suggested quilting. The room found its laughter, not cruel at first, just relieved to have something obvious to pile onto the newcomer. A pair of winged Kinetic cadets whistled, a low note of polite disbelief. A coral with jointed hands clacked his knuckles as if applauding an amateur performance. Surak's smile widened until his fangs showed. "Fabric," he announced for the benefit of those who had not yet had the pleasure. He made the word longer than necessary, like a stretch before a sprint. "Did the quartermaster lose your crate, soft body?" She slid the suit back into the crook of her arm and reached for the metal tag clipped to the folded collar. The tag was blank to everyone else. To her, it flashed a summary through the implant at the base of her skull. Kinetic Gel System, V.12, Human Cut, Frequency Map, Brath Standard Rifle Family, AUX, Temp Dampening, AUX, Micro Seal, Cert, Dome Live Fire Approved. The words settled into the quiet place in her chest where worry should have lived. "My crate arrived," she said. "This is mine." She said it without heat. She had learned long ago that anger only fed certain kinds of opponents. Calm turned into a mirror much faster. "You will not last a second under live discharge," said another Brath, smaller than Surak, with greenish scales near his temples that marked adolescence. He stood as if he wanted her to measure him. "Our rifles will punch through that garment. Your house must be very poor." She did not tell him her house had 3 floors stacked above a bakery that smelled like sugar and heat, and a mother who worked nights and slept with a hand over her heart as if cupping a fragile flame, and a father whose name on a memorial wall had trained her to fold pain into something that walked on its own legs. She did not tell him that price and value rarely matched in places where survival depended on speed rather than ceremony. She hung the suit from a locker hook and pressed her palm to the locker's interface until it read her pattern and sealed. The laughter moved restlessly from cadet to cadet and then ebbed, bored with a target that refused to bleed. Conversation grew legs again. Someone tuned a holoscreen to the day's briefing scroll. Someone else began the ritual sharpening of a vibroblade, even though the Academy's code prohibited live edges inside the barracks. The blade's hum sounded like a petulant insect. She ignored it. She unpacked small things: a toothbrush, a roll of pressure tape, a pair of thin gloves stitched with capacitive threads, a packet of ration bars that all tasted like different words for adequate. She placed each item with the care of someone who had slept in transit more often than in beds. A shadow fell over her shoulder. "Commander on deck," someone called too late. and half the room rose as Commander Reth entered with the measured stride of a man who understood that rhythm intimidated more effectively than volume. He wore no armor and no insignia beyond the single silver bar at his throat that allowed him to go anywhere and do anything inside the dome without challenge. He studied the room, not to be impressed, but to take inventory, and then his gaze stopped on the only human in the bay. "Vance," he said, and her spine straightened of its own accord. "Sir," she said. He inclined his head toward the hanging suit that looked like a wrong answer to a life-or-death question. "Quartermaster approved?" "Yes, sir." "Dome cert?" "Yes, sir." He made a note on his slate without looking down. "Good. Live fire drill at 0800. You will report in that suit. If you are ejected, you will report to medical, then to me, and you will explain exactly why you trusted marketing copy with your life." A jitter of amusement ran through the room. Surik leaned forward, happy to be an audience inside someone else's theater. Kara kept her voice level. "Understood, sir." Reth's eyes were the color of old metal. He did not smile. He did not frown. He let silence stretch another beat, and then cut it with a nod. "Welcome to the Academy." He walked on, leaving the scent of cold air and strictness in his wake. After he left, the room exhaled. Surik did not. He stood and crossed to her locker with the casual insolence of someone confident that consequences applied to other people first. He looked at the suit without touching it. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "in my clan, we bury the weak under the armor of the strong. It gives the next generation something to carry." He looked at her face as if examining a map for a route he had not taken before. "When you make a fool's choice, the instructor's ledger gains a mark. We pay for marks." "I understand ledgers," she said. He tilted his head, amused by her refusal to thread a metaphor with him. "In the dome, you will not have time for clever lines. In the dome, I will have time to do what I trained to do." She did not add that clever lines had saved her life once when a boarding party cut through a freighter's bulkhead and a pirate with a soft spot for wit gave her 3 seconds to make him laugh. 3 seconds had been enough to close a hatch and open a vent that tried to steal the breath from her lungs and taught her which parts of fear could be stripped for parts. Surik's nostrils flared slightly, as if scenting something hidden. He stepped back and rejoined his cluster of Brath cadets, who greeted him with a tilt of heads that telegraphed respect. Kara took the suit down from the hook and traced the seam at the collar with her thumb. She remembered the engineer in the subterranean lab on Mars Sector 3, a woman with ink-stained fingers who had said, "It will look unimpressive." That is the point. The gel does not like to be seen. She had demonstrated by dropping a metal slug onto a tiny square of the material. The gel had accepted the blow and distributed it so evenly that the slug bounced as if it had struck a spring. The engineer had smiled, a tired curl of mouth that belonged to someone used to not being believed. "It learns," she had said, "up to a point. You tune it, you feed it data, you map frequency signatures the way musicians map chord progressions. Give it a song, and it will catch the beat." Kara had thought of that square of gel when she signed the order for a human cut and the frequency map that matched the Brath standard rifle family to the 3rd decimal. She had thought of it when she recorded a quiet message for her mother because correspondence arrived out of sequence and it hurt less to send than to wait. She had thought of it when she stepped aboard the transport to the academy and felt the engines pull the weight of her choices tight across her ribs. Now, in the barracks full of strangers who thought laughter could measure her, she thought of it again and felt a calmness that tasted almost like hunger. Breakfast was beige. The mess hall fed entire species with a single philosophy. No one would remember the food for its flavor, but everyone would remember it for its reliability. She ate quickly and listened more than she spoke. She learned names. She learned habits. Surik ate as if every bite was a contract. A Kinetic cadet named Syl produced jokes like sleight of hand, and pocketed the ones that did not land. A scholar from the ocean world, Kesh, recited fragments of naval treaties under his breath, as if prayer and policy were siblings. Kara filed each detail into the cabinet of her mind, where nothing gathered dust. When the bell marked the shift to prep, she returned to the bay and dressed. The suit slid over her skin like cool water, and then grew warm at the joints as the microseals recognized her and settled. The interior layer kissed old scars along her shoulder where a harness buckle had once failed. The gel nested beneath the woven surface like a living thing pretending to be quiet. She fastened the seam from sternum to navel and flexed her wrists. Her range of motion remained intact, unimpeded by plates or protrusions. She looked at herself in the narrow mirror on the locker door and saw a woman who could disappear in a crowd, which had always been part of her advantage. Surik sauntered past with his breastplate slung over one shoulder. He took her in from boots to collar and snorted, not unkind, just confident in the universe as he had known it. "Last chance to requisition real armor," he said. "I heard the quartermaster stores pity next to spare clips." "I am properly equipped," she said. He laughed and clapped a hand on his own chest plate, which answered with a hollow ring. "Then we will see whose gods accept offerings today." He walked on. The corridor to the dome felt longer than geometry permitted. Lights marked the path in a sequence of pale circles that made every step feel like an appointment. The dome itself rose from the ground, like a storm held still, a sphere of layered lattice under a transparent skin, large enough to house a small city, empty enough to make a single cadet feel like the last voice in the universe. Officials took positions on the elevated ring walkway. Medics checked stretchers and murmured about supply lots and expiration dates. Commander Reth stood at the observation console with a stylus held like a conductor's baton, silent, waiting. Kara and the others filed into staging pens that smelled of ozone and dust. An instructor with a scar that kissed the corner of his mouth handed out training rifles with the brisk tenderness of someone issuing extensions of the body rather than tools. "Channels are open," he said. Friendly fire penalties doubled. "The Brath Squad will begin as attackers in Scenario 1. Human Cadet Vance, you will run point for Bravo on the South Ridge. Do not die in the first 90 seconds. It confuses the algorithm." A ripple of laughter, not cruel this time, simply human and alien in equal measure, passed through the line. Kara accepted the rifle. It felt honest in her hands. She pulled in a breath that reached the bottom of her lungs and held it for a beat, then released it with a count that steadied her pulse. She thought of her mother washing mugs in a sink that had chipped along the rim, of a window that overlooked a street where autumn made a show of pretending to be gentle, of a promise she had made to come back with a story worth the wait. She thought of the gel and the song it had been tuned to catch. Somewhere above, a horn sang the start note. Doors unsealed with a hiss. The floor under her boots vibrated as the dome woke its landscape. Ridge, ruin, dust, the long shadow of a broken tower, into place. Surik's voice crackled over the shared channel with the relish of a man stepping onto a dance floor where he chose the music. "Bravo! Consider this a courtesy," he said. "Run fast." Kara smiled once, small and private, and stepped forward into the light. Kara stepped out from the staging pen and into the artificial daylight of the dome, the glare cutting across the simulated ridge like a blade. The ground was a mixture of hardened dust and composite gravel, crunching softly beneath her boots. The southern ridge loomed ahead, a jagged incline lined with shattered walls and rusted remnants of an old combat installation. The mission feed in her visor displayed the parameters in stark, efficient text. Hold the ridge for 10 minutes against an advancing force. That force was already in motion somewhere on the far side of the arena, their boots and claws and talons pressing into the earth as they moved to hunt. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, not because her hands were unsteady, but because she preferred to feel the balance of the weapon shift with every step. Above her, the observation ring shimmered faintly behind its protective field, silhouettes of instructors and commanders pacing with slow, deliberate turns. Kara could pick out Commander Reth's posture, even at this distance, the stillness of someone who preferred to learn more from watching than speaking. She moved quickly up the incline, her squad fanning out behind her in uneven formation. The two Kinetic cadets took the left flank, wings tucked tightly to avoid catching the updraft from the ridge's wind tunnels. A Coral heavy trooper lumbered to her right, each step landing with the certainty of a battering ram. The simulation wasn't meant for comfort. Gusts of air swept grit into eyes and creases, and the metallic tang of ozone from the activated force barriers lingered like a taste you couldn't wash away. Kara crouched behind a half-collapsed wall near the ridge crest, raising the rifle's sight just enough to watch for movement below. The gel in her suit flexed against her ribs, responding to the subtle shifts of her posture, distributing the weight so that her muscles carried less strain. It was warm now, like a second skin alive with silent intent. Over the comm, the exercise timer began to tick down from the 10-minute mark. The first flash of movement came quickly, shadows breaking the pale dust haze at the base of the ridge. Brath soldiers advanced in a wide arc, rifles at the ready, their scaled armor catching the false sun in quicksilver flares. The lead shape, tall and broad-shouldered, was unmistakable even at range. Surak. He moved with the deliberate rhythm of someone who already believed the outcome was inevitable. Kara kept her breathing steady, letting the scope track the lead elements without committing to a shot. She needed the Brath to commit first. It didn't take long. A bright flare erupted from Surak's rifle muzzle. A perfectly aimed shot meant not to kill, but to drive her into cover. The round met her chest squarely. Instead of the jarring impact of traditional armor, the kinetic gel responded with an almost fluid ripple that spread outward in a wave, absorbing and dispersing the force before it could even jar her footing. The slug fell harmlessly into the dust at her feet, spinning once before settling. The Kinetic to her left broke formation slightly, startled by what he had just seen. "You good?" he asked over the channel. "Perfect," she replied, eyes still locked on her scope. The Brath formation surged forward, confident the first hit had softened her up. More fire came, each shot hammering into the suit and dissipating in harmless ripples, the gel almost humming beneath her skin with each dispersal. Kara began to move sideways along the ridge, not hurriedly, but with deliberate sidesteps that kept her profile low and mobile. The more they fired, the more data the suit gathered, refining the frequency map it had been tuned with. Every impact made it faster, more precise, as if it were learning the Brath rhythm in real time. At the 4-minute mark, the attackers closed within medium range. Kara dropped into a shallow trench on the ridge's right edge, waited until the first Brath crossed into her line of fire, and sent a burst from her rifle that tagged him square in the chest, forcing his armor to register the hit and eject him from the simulation. She didn't wait to see his reaction. Momentum was everything now. Another Brath came from her blind spot, charging up the slope with a war cry that carried over the wind. Kara spun low, letting 2 more of his rounds splash uselessly across her torso before she snapped a quick, precise shot into his shoulder plate. The simulation registered the hit instantly, and he dissolved into a shimmer of static as his feed cut him out of the exercise. Her comm crackled with reports. Her left flank was under heavy push, and the Kinetic were falling back. Kara vaulted over a slab of broken wall, landed in a crouch, and used the suit's unrestricted flexibility to pivot sharply toward the collapsing flank. She caught sight of one of the winged cadets pinned down by suppressive fire. Without hesitation, she stepped into the open, drawing every Brath rifle in the sector onto herself. The kinetic gel took the punishment without complaint. Round after round flattened, their energy bleeding away into harmless dispersal. In those seconds of distraction, the Kinetic leapt free and repositioned, flanking the distracted attackers. Kara then drove forward, closing the gap until her rifle's low-range targeting mode engaged. One by one, she marked the Brath cadets out of the scenario, their frustration mounting audibly over the comm. By the 8-minute mark, the ridge was nearly clear. Only Surak remained, his rifle leveled at her as he advanced. He didn't fire immediately, and she understood why. He had seen enough by now to know brute force wasn't the answer. They began to circle each other among the shattered stone, his boots grinding against the dust, her suit whispering with subtle shifts of the gel. "It won't protect you up close," he called over the channel, his voice carrying a hint of strain. Kara didn't answer. She waited until he committed, lunging forward with the speed his armor could barely match. His rifle barked once, the round collapsing into her shoulder without effect, and then she was inside his guard, rifle muzzle pressed against the mark on his chest plate. The simulation registered the kill with a sharp tone. Surik froze, exhaled, and without another word stepped back as his form dissolved into the exit shimmer. The final seconds of the timer ticked away, and the dome lights dimmed to signal completion. Kara lowered her rifle, her suit cooling as the gel relaxed into dormancy, and scanned the ridge one last time. Not a single attacker remained. Above, she could see the faintest movement on the observation ring. Commander Reth had stepped forward to watch her more closely. She didn't hold his gaze, but she knew he had seen everything. Without a word to the others, she started back toward the staging pens, her boots leaving measured prints in the dust. The Brath rifles had been tuned into her armor's song, and she had danced to it until there was no one left to challenge her. Kara walked through the decontamination corridor as the dome sealed behind her, the faint hiss of the sterilizing mist rising around her boots. Her visor was already off, clipped to her belt, but the rest of the suit remained sealed, the gel still faintly warm against her skin, as though reluctant to release the tension of the fight. The corridor's lights shifted from amber to green, signaling clearance, and the heavy inner door parted to reveal the staging bay. A few cadets were already there, Kinnair, Coral, even the young Brath who had been among the first to fall, but the air was thick with an unspoken awareness of what had just happened on the ridge. She walked past them without slowing, her expression unreadable, rifle hanging loosely in her hand as if it were merely an extension of her stride. At the far end of the bay, the instructors were gathered near a holo display projecting the simulation's combat log. Data streams ran in bright columns, showing movement patterns, engagement ranges, and hit confirmations. Kara could see her own trail traced in pulsing blue, fast, precise, efficient. Surik's path, rendered in crimson, had moved with equal purpose, but ended abruptly in the final exchange. Commander Reth stood beside the display, his stylus poised over a cluster of figures. He glanced at her once as she approached, a brief meeting of eyes that gave nothing away. "Vance," he said, his tone level. "Stand by." She stopped a pace away, boots together, rifle lowered, but not set down. He turned back to the data, making annotations with short, deliberate strokes. Another instructor, a lean-faced woman with silver hair braided tight against her scalp, studied the playback with a frown that looked more like concentration than displeasure. 74% of enemy fire was concentrated on you after the 4th minute, she observed. No drop in mobility, no recorded destabilization on impact. Kinetic gel, Reth said simply, without looking up. Custom-tuned, Brath signature. The silver-haired instructor's eyes narrowed as she glanced toward Kara. "You brought a suit like that into a first-level drill?" "It's regulation approved," Kara answered, her voice calm, almost quiet. "And I was issued clearance for the frequency map before the cycle began." The woman's frown deepened, but it was the kind that chased curiosity, not accusation. "We'll see how it holds up under mixed-caliber conditions." Reth's hand stilled, his stylus resting against the display. "We will," he said, and the tone suggested that the decision had already been made to test it sooner rather than later. From behind her, she heard the slow, deliberate tread of heavy boots. Surik emerged from the decontamination bay, helmet in the crook of his arm, his expression carved from the same stone as his ridged brow. He didn't speak at first, just came to stand near the cluster of Brath cadets who had gathered in a loose semicircle, The younger one who had mocked her in the barracks glanced between them, but said nothing. Surak's gaze met hers across the space. It wasn't the look of a man nursing a grudge. It was the sharp, measuring study of someone reassessing a puzzle he thought he'd solved. The silence between them stretched until Reth broke it with a brisk, "All right, save your glares for the sparring hall. Vance, Surak, you're both on next rotation for mixed team assault drills. Report back in 1 hour." Kara inclined her head in acknowledgement. Surak did the same, the gesture clipped and formal. As she turned to stow her rifle, she caught fragments of murmured conversation from the other cadets, words like, "took everything," "never slowed," and "breath rounds just died." She didn't let herself dwell on the ripple she had caused. Attention, in her experience, had a way of curdling if left to ferment too long. She moved to her locker and began the methodical process of weapon check, cleaning each component until it gleamed under the harsh bay lighting. The suit she left on, letting the gel settle into its resting state, pliable but alert. From her peripheral vision, she noticed Surak watching her, not with the mocking ease of before, but with the quiet focus of a soldier cataloging a worthy opponent. The hour between drills passed in a haze of preparation. She ate a ration bar without tasting it, refilled her canteen, and ran a systems check on the suit's internal diagnostics. The display confirmed what she already felt. The gel had adapted mid-exercise, narrowing its dispersal curve for maximum efficiency against the Brath rifles. It had learned exactly what she needed it to, and that knowledge sat in the fibers now, waiting. When the call came for the mixed team drills, the staging bay filled quickly. Kara found herself assigned to a unit split between Brath and Kinetic, with Surak as the opposing team's second in command. The objective was different this time: infiltration and retrieval under active resistance, live fire from multiple species, multiple calibers, each with its own frequency signature. It was exactly the kind of test Reth had hinted at. As the teams moved into their starting positions, Kara could feel the subtle tension in her own muscles, not from fear, but from the awareness that this was no longer about proving the suit's capability. It was about proving her own adaptability beyond the narrow edge of preparation. The dome's landscape shifted again, this time into the skeletal remains of a cityscape, all sharp angles and narrow choke points. The air shimmered faintly with the heat distortion programmed into the simulation, and every broken wall felt like it might hide an ambush. She adjusted her grip on her rifle and tuned her awareness to the suit's microfeedback, the faint hum of gel activation, the quick pulses as it mapped incoming threat patterns. The starting signal blared, and the city swallowed them. Her unit advanced through a half-collapsed avenue, moving in disciplined bursts of cover and advance. The first shots came from a rooftop, high-velocity rounds from a Kinetic sniper rifle. The gel caught the first impact on her shoulder, dispersing it with a different ripple, tighter, sharper, as if bracing for a faster rhythm. She returned fire, forcing the sniper into cover, while the coral heavy in her team breached a side building. The engagement shifted rapidly. Plasma bolts from a coral sidearm seared through the air, their frequency a new pulse against the gel. She felt it adjust again, the sensation like a second heartbeat finding its pace. Every movement became a calculation, not just where to be, but what to allow the suit to learn, when to take the hit so it could adapt, and when to avoid contact altogether to maintain mobility. She pushed forward, marking targets, directing her unit through alleys choked with simulated debris. Twice she caught sight of Surak across the engagement zone, both times in the thick of combat, both times with the same assessing look when his eyes found hers. By the time the retrieval point came into view, Kara's suit had absorbed and mapped 4 distinct weapon profiles. Her team secured the objective with 2 minutes left on the clock, extracting under suppressive fire that glanced off her without slowing her pace. When the end signal blared and the simulation faded, she stood in the center of the fading city, her breathing steady, the gel cooling into stillness. As the dome returned to its neutral state, she looked up toward the observation ring. Reth was there, speaking quietly to the silver-haired instructor. The woman's expression had shifted, still serious, but no longer skeptical. If anything, she looked intrigued. Kara didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had moved the line forward again, and tomorrow it would move further still. Kara remained on the dome floor longer than most after the mixed team drill ended, letting the simulated wind die down and the echoes of weapon fire fade into the hollow silence that always followed an exercise. She finally shouldered her rifle and made her way toward the staging bay, where the other cadets were already unsealing armor and stripping away the heat-damp layers beneath. The brass clustered together near the decontamination corridor, their voices low but not hostile, though she could sense from their glances that the assessment of her had shifted again. Surik stood slightly apart from them, helmet tucked under his arm, his expression still difficult to read. When her eyes met his, there was no challenge there, no mockery, just a steady acknowledgement, like two soldiers silently recognizing the other's presence on the field. Commander Reth's voice cut through the low murmur. "Vance, with me." It was not a request. She followed him out of the staging bay, down a narrow service corridor that led to one of the tactical analysis rooms. The space was dimly lit, walls lined with hollow projectors and modular displays showing the shifting landscapes of recent simulations. A single long table stood in the center, its surface alive with data feeds from the last two drills. The silver-haired instructor was there as well, arms folded, her eyes already fixed on the projection of Kara's movement patterns. "Sit," Reth said, gesturing to a chair opposite them. She did, resting her rifle across her knees as the projection replayed the first ridge defense in stark, glowing lines. "You know why you're here," Reth began. "You performed above expected parameters. That's not in dispute, but performance like that gets attention, and attention comes with questions." The instructor leaned forward. Kinetic gel tuned to a specific enemy profile is rare, even among advanced forces. Using it here raises operational considerations. "It was issued within regulation," Kara said evenly. "You can confirm that through the quartermaster logs." "We have," the instructor replied. "That's not the issue. The issue is what happens when an asset like that is targeted because of what it can do. You won today because the conditions matched your preparation. Tomorrow, those conditions will change." Kara met her gaze. "Then I'll adapt." The instructor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Kara thought she might push harder. Instead, she leaned back. Reth switched the projection to the second drill, the urban infiltration, and highlighted the points where Kara had deliberately taken hits. "You allowed the suit to learn during combat," he observed. "That's calculated risk. Not all cadets understand how to turn their own body into bait without getting killed." "It's the only way to make the gel more effective," Kara said. "You can't program instinct into it. It has to feel the rhythm of incoming fire to adjust its dispersal curve." "And you're not afraid of what happens if you misjudge that rhythm?" the instructor asked. Kara's mouth curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "If I was afraid of that, I wouldn't be here." Reth exchanged a brief look with the instructor, then powered down the table's projection. "You'll continue drills under mixed conditions, but I want you prepared for command scenarios. You've shown you can execute. Now I want to see if you can lead." Kara blinked once, not because the idea startled her, but because she understood what it meant. More scrutiny, more responsibility, more opportunities for others to resent her. She nodded once. "Understood." The meeting ended without ceremony. She returned to the barracks to the sound of laughter and muted conversation, the air carrying the smell of recycled heat from the mess hall. Her bunk looked the same as it had that morning, the suit's outer layer folded neatly at the foot, its inner gel sheathing still faintly pulsing from the day's activity. As she sat, she became aware of someone standing nearby. Surik. He regarded her with the same steady, measuring look he had carried since the first drill. "You fight differently," he said. It wasn't an insult, nor was it quite a compliment. "You watch before you move. You let the enemy believe he's dictating the fight until you close it on your own terms. She tilted her head slightly. It works. It worked today, he said, his voice even. We'll see if it works tomorrow. He turned to leave, but paused at the barracks door. The young one, Tar, won't mock your suit again. I told him why. She said nothing, only gave the smallest nod, but when he left, she exhaled slowly. Respect from a Brath wasn't given lightly, and it wasn't easily won back once lost. That night, as the barracks lights dimmed, Kara lay on her bunk staring at the faint seams in the ceiling. The gel rested in the locker beside her, but she could still feel its subtle weight in her mind, the way it had shifted and adapted with every blow. The instructors were right. Tomorrow the weapons would be different, the terrain less forgiving, the enemies less predictable. But that was the point. She didn't need the fight to be the same. She needed only to find its rhythm, and once she did, the gel, and she, would dance to it until the last shot was fired. The next morning began without the usual slow hum of the barracks coming to life. Kara woke before the lights cycled to day mode, lying still on her bunk with her eyes open, listening to the silence. There was a weight in the air that hadn't been there before, a muted anticipation that seemed to settle over every cadet in the academy. When the overhead glow finally replaced the dim night strips, she rose without hurry, went to her locker, and unsealed it. The kinetic gel suit was cool against her hands, pliable in its resting state, the faint surface pattern almost invisible in the early light. She slid into it with practiced precision, sealing the front from sternum to navel, and felt the micro-seals engage with soft, imperceptible clicks. The gel adjusted to her body's warmth, as if waking alongside her. By the time she reached the mess hall, the space was already half full. Conversations were quieter than usual, and heads turned briefly in her direction before returning to their trays. Surik was there, seated with a group of Brath, but his eyes found hers and held them for a moment. He gave no greeting, but his gaze held none of the condescension she had first met on her arrival. That alone was enough to confirm what she suspected. Today's drill was not just another exercise, it would be decisive. The call came earlier than expected. Commander Reth's voice over the comm system summoned all combat-capable cadets to Dome 2, the larger of the Academy's 2 simulation spheres, reserved for multi-environment scenarios that pushed adaptability to the edge. Kara arrived to find both observation rings active, filled with officers, instructors, and a scattering of higher-ranking guests whose uniforms bore insignia she didn't recognize. The silver-haired instructor was among them, speaking quietly to Reth, both watching the cadets assemble. The briefing was short and delivered without embellishment. The mission was a multi-phase endurance simulation, no timed objective, no fixed terrain. The dome would shift through different environments without pause, mixing weapon types and enemy tactics drawn from across the Academy's arsenal. Elimination would be permanent for the duration, and the final standing cadet's performance would be reviewed at the command level. It wasn't lost on Kara that this meant potential placement into specialized units. When the teams were drawn, she found herself placed opposite Surak for the first time since their initial clash. The moment their eyes met, she understood it had been intentional. Reth wanted to see what happened when the two of them met in earnest, without the constraints of being on the same side. The dome's interior flared to life in a sudden burst of light and color. The first terrain was a dense alien jungle, canopy thick enough to blot out half the simulated sky, the air heavy and damp with artificial humidity. Kara moved quickly into cover, the gel in her suit adjusting almost instantly to the shift in temperature. She could feel the faint, low-frequency hum of incoming fire before she heard it, a Brath-pattern rifle. The gel took the first hit without trouble, dispersing the energy in a ripple across her chest. She returned fire, tagging a Kinetic who had been moving through the lower brush. The terrain shifted without warning. The jungle dissolved into a rocky desert under a blazing sun, the sudden glare forcing her pupils to contract sharply. The gel adjusted again, this time balancing temperature regulation with impact dispersal. Plasma fire from a coral sidearm seared toward her position. She rolled behind a boulder, let the gel register the frequency, and then moved out to draw the shooter's aim while a teammate flanked. The hit she took to the back plate resonated differently, sharper, faster, but the suit absorbed it and held. Minutes blurred into an unbroken rhythm of adaptation. The environments came harder now: icy tundra with reduced visibility, a derelict space station with narrow corridors that forced close-quarters engagement, then a wide-open field under low gravity where every step had to be calculated to avoid overextension. Each shift brought a new set of weapons to absorb, map, and neutralize. Kara used every moment, letting the gel learn without letting the hits slow her, until she felt the suit's responses become instinctive extensions of her own reflexes. The final phase dropped her into an urban war zone at dusk. Half the simulation's combatants were already eliminated. Her HUD marked Surek's position somewhere ahead, his movement path cutting across hers in a slow, deliberate sweep. She advanced cautiously through the narrow streets, her rifle held close, boots silent on the cracked pavement. The air was filled with the echo of distant simulated artillery and the hiss of static from damaged street lamps. She caught sight of him as he emerged from behind the shell of a burned-out transport. His armor was scratched from previous engagements, the scales at his jaw darkened with simulation residue. He saw her instantly, and in that moment, the rest of the battlefield seemed to vanish. He raised his rifle, fired a burst that struck her square in the torso. The gel took it easily. She advanced without breaking pace. She returned fire, forcing him behind cover, and circled to cut off his retreat. What followed was less a firefight than a duel of positioning. Feints, sudden advances, and calculated retreats. He tried to force her into narrow angles where his strength could overpower her, but she slipped away each time, using the suit's full range of mobility to stay fluid. Twice he landed shots that might have staggered another cadet, but the gel absorbed them and gave her the seconds she needed to counter. The end came when he tried to draw her into an exposed avenue, his weapon angled for a decisive strike. She let him believe she had taken the bait, stepped into the open, and drew his fire. The gel took the full brunt of the hit, the energy dispersal sharp and clean. In the split second that followed, she raised her rifle and fired, her shot hitting the mark on his chest plate with precision. His form shimmered, dissolved, and vanished from the simulation. When the final elimination tone echoed across the dome, Kara was still standing. The urban war zone dissolved into the neutral white of the simulation chamber, the air suddenly still and dry. She lowered her rifle, her breathing steady, and looked up at the observation ring. Commander Reth was watching her, his expression as unreadable as ever, but his stance had shifted, just slightly, as though he were now looking at someone who belonged on a different level entirely. Back in the staging bay, the silence around her was different from the one she had felt on her first day. It wasn't suspicion now, or mockery, it was recognition. Even the Brath cadets didn't look away when she passed. Surek was there, already out of his armor, his gaze meeting hers once more. This time, he gave a single, slow nod. She returned it without a word. Later, alone in the barracks, she sat on the edge of her bunk with the suit folded neatly beside her. The gel was cooling into its dormant state, but she could still feel the phantom hum of its earlier rhythm in her bones. She knew the next challenge would come soon, and it would be different. The weapons would change, the terrain would shift, the opponents would adapt, but so would she. And when it came, she would be ready, because she had learned the truth the suit had been teaching her all along. Survival was not about withstanding a single kind of fire. It was about becoming fluent in every language of battle.